Hello, everyone. I am very happy today to have another conversation with my friend Steve Peters. After our first conversation, we thought we could continue for days and weeks to talk about important horse topics. I was fortunate I could see Steve for a few days in May, it was, when he was in Germany to give one of his um, horse brain clinics. And we just thought we need to do another YouTube conversation for everyone because there are just so many topics to talk about. So, welcome, Steve.
Oh, it's good to be back, and it was really a pleasure to be able to connect again. And I have to tell you, everyone, I just have to brag on how Nancy's brain works. But as I was speaking, usually with a translator, you think that somebody gives some information and then takes a break, and then the translator gives the translated part of the message. Nancy gave and on demand, simultaneously as I was talking about even complicated scientific subjects, Nancy was translating, and she had a whole table around her because I think her translation might have even been better than what I was saying. But she was so precise, and to to be able to hear something and immediately give it back was pretty impressive, to say the least.
Thank you very much.
But she's able to do that because, she's got a great knowledge of the horse, and then she studied neurology of the horse as well. And so it was a perfect mix. So if you missed it, you missed something great.
Yeah, I mean, it's the topics I love. So it's everything I light up when we talk about those things. So today I would start off because that popped up a little bit during the clinic as well, that very often, as we have a human brain, we can only think with our human brain. And very often people tend to humanize horses. So to think like horses would think like humans. And that is, in my experience as a horse trainer, very unfair often because it's like feelings like secondary emotions like let's say envy or doing something on purpose or feeling ashamed or guilty or stuff like that. Horses just do not have the cognitive capacities to actually create such emotions, but people very often have interpretations of their horse's behavior where they think the horse would react in a certain way because of this or that. So I would like you, from your point of view, to elaborate a little bit from your expertise on this topic of how dangerous it can be if we think that horses think like humans.
That's a great topic. Now, most of what you're talking about, executive functioning, abstract thinking, contingency planning, being able to think about the future, those are all what we call frontal lobe tasks. Now, horses also have a frontal lobe, but evolutionarily, it's designed for them to meet their ecological niche. So, what does that mean? Well, a large portion of their frontal lobe is used for voluntary motor movement. So some of the motor cortex creeps up into the frontal lobe and attention as well.
Yeah.
But certainly horses are not planning ahead, planning to try to fool you. Now, it's easy for humans to think that because the only frame of reference that most humans have, excuse me, is their own brain.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. That's the only brain that they live with every day. So
The only one we
it's
have.
easy for them to make that comparison. But if your horse doesn't come along and see a flake of hay and look around and say, I'm going to kick it under this bush. No other horses saw me. I'm coming back on Tuesday and I'm going to get that flake of hay, right? They also don't try to make fun of someone and purposely and then go back and tell all the other horses so they're all laughing over the fence. Now, as ridiculous as that seems, we actually act as though that's the truth, regardless. And what is so bad about that? Well, oftentimes, if we are attributing things to the horse's brain that the horse's brain is not capable of doing, and we call it disrespectful, for example,
Hmm.
then that justifies punishment. That justifies harsh treatment. And punishment does not play a role in learning at all. In fact, I don't think punishment plays a role at all in any horse care in terms of their welfare and being ethical.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's what we project, our stories in our brain functioning, in our emotional being onto the horse is actually unfair to the horse. They are incredibly capable, but they do not live in your world.
Yeah.
They live in a different world. Their perceptions are all different. They smell things that you don't smell. They see things you don't smell. They hear things you don't hear. So they're not even living in your world.
Yeah.
Now, what they do speak is nervous system. They are very sensitized to your nervous system. So, you know, it doesn't help us to take their nervous system to a high level of sympathetic arousal by punishment, by yelling, by getting frustrated with our horse, which they can feel. It also doesn't help if we have uh, emotional issues and we bring those in and play those out in the environment with the horse.
Mm.
Here's what we do need to be aware of. We are the environment. What I mean by that is your rhythm, your movement, the energy that you put out. You're not just a trainer, you are the environment for your horse. And
Absolutely.
you really need to be aware of that because if you're unaware, even of your own emotions, then we can carry that in, and the horse is an innocent victim.
Yeah.
Their nervous system, they're they're a victim of their own neurochemistry, and we may be responsible for changing
Yeah.
their neurochemistry. If we fill them up with norepinephrine because we come on aggressively, then we've flooded their brain, and they're a victim now of what we've done.
Mm.
So to blame the horse really has no benefit and really adds no clarity, doesn't help us with our connection, doesn't help us with our relationship. So there's two nervous systems interacting when we come together.
Yeah.
But if we're reading everything with that lens, with those glasses that says that's another human in a big furry suit, then yeah, and especially if we struggle in our human relationships, then we try to go and superimpose that on the horse. Well, we've really got problems then.
Yeah. I agree 100%. And the importance of being aware of our own state, I think, is something which cannot be said enough, how important that is, because in our modern world, a lot of people lack the connection to their own state, to really be in the present moment, which is, as we know, the only moment where we can meet the horse, because they are only now. They react only now. They don't react about what you did yesterday, and they don't react of what you're planning to do in the future. They react what you are representing for them now. And if it is your energy, your request, the stimulus you apply, whatever it is. And I think in terms of stress responses, because when as long as we're in this frame in arousal where the horse can still learn, if we're not over aroused, everything is fine. But the moment our stress response, the horse is too aroused and the survival instinct kicks in, the stress responses like flight, fight, freeze, and so on are triggered. Anyhow, learning is not possible anymore. And in that context, because in our last conversation we elaborated on flight, fight, and on freeze, And in humans, there is as well now, there's another stress response counted as a scientific stress response when you ask the big internet for good information, and which is the fawn response. And very often I hear people in the horse world talk about that horses would have a fawn response as well. And to me, that is a fawn response. It's basically this Bambi reflex in humans. So when we experience something and as a child or whatever, often it's learned as a child, and then we see, ooh, if I behave different, I'm treated better, or if I behave different, I'm not punished. So, but this requires of our brain that we can think of what we did in the past and then adjust our future behavior to a certain outcome. So it demands from us that we can kind of make plans, strategize, and so on. So, what's your take on fawn responses in horses?
You know, it's almost like m when they used to put out in the statistical manual about psychological disturbances. They'd have things like multiple personality disorder. And so you can slice that pie so many times and you could say, this is my angry self, this is my sad self, this is, and still be within a normal range. But if you label everything, and I think psychology is famous for that, but human psychology, because we have a different frontal lobe, since we have a different brain, doesn't really lend itself to superimposing on a mammal whose brain functions differently. So I think we get caught up far too much in in coming up with labels and theories
Hmm.
versus if you understood the brain functioning and the nervous system, which is much more evidence-based,
Hmm.
then I think you can be more accurate. And the key here is accuracy. You really want clarity in your messages with your horse. Misunderstanding and confusion really gets them sympathetically aroused because that's threatening to them. They don't want to be punished. And when they're confused, that creates a lot of stress.
Hmm.
So being clear in our messages, and oftentimes that means simplifying things. I don't want to, point the finger at anyone, but sometimes you'll hear a story when you ask somebody about their horse that's so elaborate, and it's a beautiful story with fine details, and as literature, it might be a wonderful story, but at points you wonder how far removed is that from what's actually going on a simple neurological neurological basis. And if you're so caught in the story, your horse does not speak or read English. And so the only communication, only language we can speak is limbic system language. The only language we can speak is nervous system to nervous system. So the more we get in our head, literally up there using our big frontal lobe that can create all kinds of abstract meanings, right? We're getting farther removed from our horse
Yeah.
in terms of our communication and our in our connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's exactly, you know what you said, it's in the beginning, you said this thing about the senses that your horse literally perceives a different world than you do, you know? It's like about there's frequency ranges of sound waves which they can perceive, which we cannot perceive. You know, it's like our cats as well. For example, cats do see complete different ranges of light, the light spectrum. So for sure, they're literally living in a different world than we do because we do perceive our environment via our senses, the sensory input, and we can only perceive what our senses are capable of. So if we think, for example, of the horse and how their senses work, there's different frequency ranges. So they literally live in a different world. And I find that is when you, because you said it before, that is so when you get aware of that. you really must, for me, it makes me feel very humble, and I need to step back and think like, oh wow, there's so much here which I am not perceiving, which they are perceiving, which maybe completely explain why they're behaving how they're behaving. So, however a horse is behaving, if it is what I expected to, if it is what I wanted, the horse is always right with what his information about this moment. And this is as well something concerning the nervous system. One part of it is this perception, reaction, learning aspect, which we talked about as well in the last video a lot. And another aspect which I find very important is that movement as well. When people think of movement and the horse's body, it's very often they think like, oh yeah, the brain is important for learning, like I teach my horse something new and whatever. Um, and they think of the body as a skeleton with muscles and so on, and training, but that a muscle can only be activated via the nervous system, so via the brain, and that movement patterns are happening and are affected acted out from the brain to the body, and um, how important that is for understanding really like what the brain and the nervous system do, because it literally does everything, and you said as well, we want to talk a little bit about horse welfare today, because there is nothing we do with our horses which does not have an effect on their nervous system.
Absolutely. Actually every movement, every perception, every sensation, every reaction, every bit of processing involves the brain and involves the entire nervous system. And you're right. If you have horses and you just, let's say all the owners just suddenly fell over and disappeared, and the horses were out in a pasture, they would eat, move, eat, move, eat, move, eat, move, but lots of movement.
Yeah,
Um, and that provides proprioception, especially if it's on different topography, those messages all go through the sensory system up to the thalamus in the brain. But not only movement in terms of brain messaging, there's a psychological and emotional component to movement. In fact, horses are tuned to that. The foal, who is quickly on its feet so that it can survive, is getting all kinds of myelination throughout the brain through movement. It's movement that sends those glutamate messages. And as soon as those messages start firing, it excites cells in the brain, oligodendrocytes that arrive there and start wrapping that network in myelin. So now we're getting very smooth movements, and there's a synchrony that occurs naturally in movement.
mm,
So if you watch, that foal will soon be in step with its mother. And if you turn loose a large number of horses, watch how many are on the same footfall.
yeah,
So this synchrony and this harmony is built in, and it has an emotional component. They feel comfortable and they seek it out. If we are aware of that, that can really help our horsemanship,
yeah,
because we can be in sync with them. We can be in rhythm. We can have a dance that's matching each other. We can have a dialogue. Or if you decide you need to be in control and you're going to have a monologue and you're going to restrain your horse, you interrupt that dance. And
yeah,
so oftentimes, without understanding movement and its importance, even think in primitive terms, when when humans would dance as a tribe and
yeah,
play the drum beat that simulated a heartbeat and
exactly.
would start to move together, they after a while their heart rates began to synchronize, their respiration began to synchronize, and they moved as one, and that bonded them as a community
Yeah,
because of the oxytocin and the trust that's involved. But it's movement that does that. And There's reasons we have things like walking meditations
Yeah.
because you're moving out into nature. And as far as we're going to divorce ourselves from nature, as far as we are not going to hunt for meeting that horse in its synchrony, then we actually are going to create a, a, a brace or a block in that information. So the biggest two of the biggest stressors in horses' lives, one is isolation, but the other is restraint. And that can be any kind of restraint.
Yeah. Not enough movement as well. I mean, we have like we touched on it last time a little bit that, for example, the horses in Europe have a lot less space. And like there's a lot of areas as well especially in Germany, in the north of Germany, where you have like flat green pastures, but there's not a lot of stimuli from the ground, different, like rocky areas or mountains. So already the young horses, when they are starting to wire their brain, it's like the diversity of movement is not that diverse. And then I see it very often when horses are trained in riding that, and people repeat like a lot, very often for certain disciplines, the same movements and don't do a lot of alternative gymnastics in between, that horses, because it's like use it or lose it in the brain. It's like when you don't activate certain neurons, after a while, the connection, the road gets bumpy a little bit, that's you don't have the nice highway anymore. So very often I get, when I work with rehab horses, you have those horses where people then think, oh, whatever, I'm going to say just an example. Oh yeah, get the shoulder in and that will make that movement better. And I'm like, for a good shoulder in, the horse needs to know how to activate certain muscles as well, if it's a muscle group they haven't used for a while. So, it's not the exercise which will explain the movement to the horse. It's the horse's brain being capable of activating the right muscles to do that movement. And that's a very different thinking that, it's not like you say, it's not the volt which will bend the horse. You need a bent horse to be able to do a small circle. So that's very often as well where I think that we tend with our human brain, we think like outcome based, but we lose the journey. And it's very often actually that the journey starts far earlier. And for example, talking of horse welfare, restricted movement, not having a lot of different terrains, not having proprioception in the hooves because you just have soft, flat ground everywhere. All these things make those horses, from a neurological point of view, as well, less capable of being a healthy horse with a very well wired brain.
If in the psychological, emotional component of movement, and you can't divorce these because it's all a system.
Yeah.
So to put a horse on a walker and walk them round and round and round endlessly, where they check out, would be no different to you than if we just hook you to the clothesline and let you walk around and around and around. If we force a horse into an abnormal position, because, aesthetically, we feel they should be forced into a frame. In numbers of disciplines, actually, social license is starting to play a role. And if we're not aware of the welfare piece involved with the horses, some of these disciplines may go by the wayside because, horses that are made to look as though they're limping, with their heads in abnormal position, way pulled back beyond, the diagonal, um, that we can call that exercise because we feel we're exercising certain muscle groups, etc. That's not the same thing as natural movement and natural motion for a healthy horse. So we really should define that as two different uh, um, areas altogether with different benefits and different problems.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, in human athletes as well, the soccer player will do different movements as well to keep his body healthy, and not only the movements for playing soccer. And that's like, I find that interesting. And what you said about the as well the indigenous people, like that they use a lot of rhythm, and it's for bonding, and what type of uh, chemicals it creates, bonding hormones, oxytocin and so on, and it creates as well coherence in the different areas of the brain. That's what we use in meditation as well. We can use these different types of beats as well to get to a more coherently working brain, because a brain which is in disorder, is a stressed brain, is actually working a lot less well. It cannot function in a healthy, good way. And we do not only have movement, but even all our organ functioning is directed by the nervous system. So if we have all these, chemical imbalances with stress hormones and so on, that literally creates dis-ease over long term. So you make horses sick as well, like humans as well.
Yeah, the gastrointestinal system all together, it gets impacted. And we're finding this out more. Research is now looking more
Mhm.
at the gut-brain axis, looking more
Yeah,
at the gut microbiome. And these will all be terms that you'll hear more of in the future. And once again, it's the entire system. And as you mentioned, we could take they've taken horses that were isolated and in box stalls and compared them to horses that were moving together in a pasture. And they looked at the blood plasma levels in those two groups of horses. And what they found was that the blood plasma levels of 5-HT, which is a precursor to serotonin, and serotonin is the neurotransmitter associated with emotional balance. It's our antidepressant medications are oftentimes like Prozac is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it works with the serotonin system. So it looks neurochemically like the horses that are in stalls, isolated, unable to move, are in a state of depression neurochemically, and
Mhm.
those other horses are in a state of emotional balance
Yeah,
because they're out moving around. So it's not just physical. Even the neuroendocrine system is impacted by this. And stress, long time chronic stress like that, actually will shrink the brain.
absolutely. And could you elaborate, because this, what is the short, the BDNF is the English short, I think.
Yes.
The brain-derived neurotrophic, oh la la, I have a knot
You
in my
got it.
tongue. It is created by movement as well. So basically, lack of movement. I mean, I will just put it like in not very not very nice terms, makes you less smart as well, because your brain cannot create connections that well. Could you explain that to the listeners?
Sure. In fact, we'll look at human research and we'll look at horse research because there's research in both that say almost exactly the same thing. BDNF, it stands for brain derived, so it's made by the brain. You can't go to the drugstore and get, even though there are companies that will try to this is spend your money on something that's actually evidence-based. But brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it's neuroprotective.
Yeah.
So how do you get this substance that's neuroprotective? And what would that do for me? It creates neuroplasticity, which means that your brain is better able to wire and your messages are going to be stronger and you're going to have more avenues of movement in your brain for information to travel. But you have to do some things in order to get brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and there are some things that will deplete it.
Mhm.
One of the things that will deplete it is sleep. I mean, lack of sleep, sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
So many horses, when they're sold and they're taken outside a herd or they're in a stressful environment, don't feel comfortable laying down completely supine. So what happens is they don't get REM sleep. So they become chronically sleep deprived, which impacts their immune system. So system, once again, they'll start stumbling on their feet. They'll fall asleep on their feet as they're standing. And um, this tremendously impacts their welfare and depletes BDNF. Stress, uh, high levels of cortisol and stress hormones in your system will deplete BDNF. Well, how do I get more of it? How do I create this? For humans, cardiovascular and aerobic exercise, movement. You got to get out and move. Patients used to say, "Oh, you mean I have to exercise?" I would say, if you don't like the word exercise, call it your brain maintenance program,
Yeah.
because that's what it
Great.
is. It will protect your brain over time. Another thing besides movement that impacts it is diet. Saturated fats and sugars. In humans, saturated fats and sugars will feed a dementia.
Mhm.
And in horses, the same thing. Those sugary grains, they need forage, they need grass, they need hay. Those things their system is designed to make use of.
Mhm.
And they've done just fine until feed companies have told us, no, we need special performance H2976, you know, uh, that our scientists on our payroll have determined are perfect for your horse. Well, there's some more money that you can potentially save and help your horse in the long run. So BDNF makes your brain more resilient to stress. So if you have higher levels of BDNF because you're exercising, you have a good diet, then outside stressors are not going to impact you in the same way and shrink your brain.
Mhm.
So if our horses are not getting enough sleep, if our horses are getting sugary grain, if we're overly aggressive with our horses and they're always sympathetically aroused and can't reset their nervous system, they're hyper alert now because we've pushed them in that way. And if we lock them up for 23 hours in a box stall, in a sensory deprivation box, then we are going to shrink neurons. Our BDNF levels are going to be low. And our horses, we might not call them depressed in human terms, but if you look at their neurobiology, they certainly have all indications of depression. So we can love our horses to death. And here's an interesting finding. Here's a pretty interesting finding because you'll find the justification oftentimes for putting a horse in a stall is that I don't want them with the other horses because they'll be injured. But what they find, actually, there's a brand new book on equine welfare. I think it's called Equine Welfare, that's just chock full of scientific citations. It's written by a number of scientists, authors, and the findings seem to indicate that you're more prone to injury if you're standing still in a stall for long periods of time. Then you have to go out and perform athletically. We wouldn't take somebody who's training to be a 100-yard sprinter champion and lock them in the closet and pull them out, every once in a while to go and run. They'd pull their muscles, they wouldn't be able to perform. They're more prone to injury. Even on a psychological, emotional basis, you know, if the payoff is your horse gets scraped up, they lose a little hide, um, is that really worth locking them away so that they're isolated, they're depressed? I mean, do you want to teach a horse to learn something if they're depressed? We can't learn when we're depressed. Our brains are overwhelmed, or if we're shrinking the horse's brain because of stress and causing neurons and dendrites to die off, Is that the horse we want to be teaching? I would think we'd want to optimize their neurochemistry. Oxytocin is a bonding,
Yeah.
uh, trust-related neurohormone. Dopamine is, and dopamine, they get dopamine. The largest hits of dopamine are in new situations. So learning new information, exploring, curiosity. If we drill, we drill, we drill. Each progressive drill lowers the amount of dopamine that horse gets until it gets almost none. And then it gets aggravated, then it gets upset, and we're changing the neurochemistry now. And then if we don't like the fact that we've made our horse agitated and we get after them, we're heading in the wrong direction. We're getting sympathetically aroused, norepinephrine, and we can get to the point that the horse says, I don't want you on my back, or
Hmm.
I'm not going to be here. I'm running away as fast as I possibly can. And if you block all that and they freeze on you, they check out, they go somewhere else, and now you might as well be trying to teach the horse on the carousel
Yeah.
a task because that's where that horse is. All those strategies end up without the information being processed and truly learned by
Hmm.
your horse. So we can work with the nervous system
Yeah.
or we can work against it. But working against it's not good for you, and it certainly is bad for their welfare.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. You touched on dopamine there, and as we know in our human world as well, you can have, let's call it dopamine hits, either from an external kind of
Mm.
reward, which this is so funny because people, there's so much information out there, which is like, ooh, sometimes I'm like, ooh. Um, Ask the person who knows, Dr. Steve. So the thing is, you can have a dopamine hit, me too, if I eat a nice sugary cake or if I scroll through my cell phone and I watch 10 minutes of one reel after the other. This will give me a dopamine hit, a very short feel-good moment, because that's what people think. Oh, a reward. They always think of dopamine only in terms of a reward. And this is like, I made a video on that after our last conversation, but maybe you could add your perspective as well, because for people to understand why a cookie as a reward, yes, the horse will like the cookie, and yes, we can enhance behavior with cookies for sure. The question is, what about the clarity of the message in the learning situation? Because I add more stimuli, and what the difference is if the horse in after having learned, having figured out a task or whatever, you give them just a pause without adding anything, they will have this internal dopamine output. And could you, in your words, again, because I think this cannot be said often enough, explain in your words what the difference really is if you get dopamine from an external locus of control, from an external stimulus, or if you get it from the inside, and what that makes as well, what that creates in horses in how they want to learn.
That's an excellent question. And I'll start by saying that, that positive reinforcement, that cookie works
It enhances.
in some situations, right? Not when my horse is bucking and bolting, am I going to reach in my pocket and pull out a cookie and necessarily solve that situation. Or at least that's not the only tool that I want. Um, but let me just pose it to the audience. You know, what we're doing with the cookie is we are shaping behavior. Right? What we're doing with an internal locus of control, where the reward is internal, is we're actually shaping a brain network. And the difference there being the the horse will do what it's asked, stimulus response, they will get their reward. How much intrinsic value is there in learning, in exploration, in learning when emotional issues come up, learning how to get back from high sympathetic arousal, and having the curiosity to want to learn something new. Now, yes, that you get dopamine from both, but it's been determined, and there's a lot of scientific evidence now on reward prediction error. When you give the horse something new, that novelty alone leads to the biggest dopamine hits. Let's say you've done an exercise and you've done it to the left 3 times in a row, and now you surprise your horse by going to the right. That novelty alone, it actually gets your horse's attention and gets a larger dopamine hit. So the drugstore is already in your horse's brain. And dopamine is the most highly rewarding substance. If you're addicted to crack cocaine, you're not really addicted to crack cocaine. You're addicted to how much dopamine floods the nucleus accumbens, the reward center in the horse's brain or the human's brain. That's where the addiction lies. The dopamine hit immediately. You smoke the crack cocaine, it immediately can get you your big hit. Um, if I have 2 children and I say, we're going to learn to read, we're going to start with Charles Dickens. And I tell one child, I want you to just read a chapter. And after you're done, come down, let's sit at the kitchen table and tell me all about what that story was about. And what did you find interesting? What did you like about it? And then come back after chapter 2 and say, oh, tell me about this. And what did you find interesting about that? And you could ask a lot of questions about that and start to develop curiosity and exploration. And so that child can't wait till, well, can't we read chapter 3? No, read it tomorrow, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss it again. I have another child, and I say, every time you read a chapter of Charles Dickens, I'm giving you $10. And you come back and you've read the chapter, and here's your $10. And they may not, they may want to buy a toy. So they say, well, I'm going to get $20. I'm going to go read that other chapter. And I'm going to get $30 and I'm going to read that third chapter. So that child now has $30. And then I say, I don't have any more money. I had to pay the bills. I don't have any more money. We have one child who doesn't care, who's going to learn to explore and now wants to read other books. Is Charles Dickens the only guy you have? Do you have some other books that I can read? So they're internally motivated. If I'm just looking for that one reward, is my motivation then to learn and read and explore, or is my motivation to get that reward? Now, I could shape the behavior and I could get that child with money to read those books. But I think you see where I'm going with this is that if dopamine is already there and I can actually work with their system to get larger doses of dopamine and create a horse brain that gets addicted to learning, not addicted to rewards, to extrinsic rewards, but it's addicted to learning. Those horses, the ears go up. What do you have next? What can we try next? And so that would be the difference. Even though on the outside you may see similar things, one is shaping the behavior, but the other is creating a brain network that actually wants to grow and add new connections to the brain. So that's the differentiation I would make.
I love that. It's like really motivating them to want to learn, and that's something when you really start with young horses from really at the beginning, because I have a lot of older horses coming in which already have problems and issues and stuff, and then you need to relearn a lot of things and not use the old pathways, try to not go back on the highways. But what I find so impressive nowadays in young horses, when I start young horses, and I start them completely different than I would have done like 10 years ago, even like 5 years ago. I start them so different now. And The first thing I want is that they, first of all, I am not stressed anymore if they don't find answers I think would be, in the past it was like I wanted them to find a certain answer, and now it's like I honor the try, So it's like I actually I try to find a solution, even if it's not the right one or not the one I intended to. I'm like to honor the try because that makes a horse which wants to say like, oh, I'll try again next time. And so they explore more, they become curious. And then you have horses who even when they learn basically that they could find solutions for situations, tasks, problems, however you want to name it. And that's so funny because a lot of issues which you usually have with horses who are afraid or who want to like get away from something, so they don't occur anymore because the horses have like the young ones, they learn a mindset to say like, oh, look at this problem. How can I solve it? And it doesn't matter if I do a mistake because I will just try again until I figure it out. And I think that's something very, very valuable as well, and to think about because very often when we work with horses, we have our outcome in mind. So when the horse tries something which was not what we intended to, we're like, oh no, don't do this, or oh no, don't do that. And I think if you say like, oh, how interesting, that was an idea. Let's try a different idea. Let's see if you have another one. It creates a complete different mindset in horses.
That's what we find in terms of brain growth, that if you learn how to solve problems, and that's how things are presented to you as problem solving tasks or problem solving scenarios, even if you get the wrong answer, you create more neuronal firing and more neuronal growth than if you just rotely do something again and again. You become very rigid and your neuronal pattern becomes very rigid. And then if anything new comes up that doesn't match that pattern, you're lost. I mean, you could learn something again and again and again remotely, but now we go for a trail ride and you come apart because so many things you haven't seen or uh, been able to process and make sense of. Yeah, so that, you know, brains are experience driven.
Yeah.
And the more experiences that we can provide, the greater the window of what your horse can tolerate stress-wise. And so their ability to learn, their window of what they're able to learn, it increases. The more that we avoid all that extra stuff around the outside and we just drill and we just do it repetitively, and that's the horse's only experience, that brain doesn't necessarily grow. And anything outside that window of what they tolerate ends up as an emotional reaction or as a stress hormone producing
Yeah.
event when it really doesn't have to be, even
Yeah.
simple things. So you're right. It's the problem solving and it's the exposure to new information. Our brain is only created for us to do the best for us to optimize our perception and experience of the world. So if we're going to survive in the world, we need to allow ourselves to experience lots of things so we have lots of options. So
Yes.
when you were talking about the horse having options, if you if you stress someone enough, even if they have options, they can't find them.
Yeah.
If you studied for a test, but you're so afraid you're going to fail that test, even if you know the information, you can feel like you're going to faint. Your mind can go blank. You don't even remember the information, right? So we get horses where if we stress them enough, even things we've taught them, their brain does not have access to those. And so then we say, "You stupid horse, you know this. You know how to do this," and we put more pressure on. It would be the same with you with test anxiety. And now we tell you, if you fail for the entire year. You might become so sweaty, you might faint in your chair, you don't have access to the information. But if you go and you calm down and you relax and you sit in the park, oh yeah, the answer to number one is this. Answer to number two is this. So oftentimes we demand of our horse what we are not capable of doing ourselves.
Absolutely. Oh, Steve, this is so nice. I think we could go on for hours, but we want to keep it like for listeners as well too. I mean, and
You
we
know,
can
we'll come back from
be
time to time. Nancy and I,
exactly.
this is what our ride in the car conversations are like.
Yeah,
The same way, you know, we just should turn on a tape recorder.
that's true.
But I love this that our back and forth. The time goes by very quickly, and we both hope that this is beneficial information in your all of your journeys with horses for your welfare and for your horses.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we close up, I see those two posters behind you because
Let me
besides
tell you a little bit about both.
exactly.
We, Martin Black and I, we wrote Evidence-Based Horsemanship, which was our book. We tried to make it accessible to people. And so a lot of scientific citations. Martin said, we're not writing the book for scientists. Just put those in the closet. We're going to make this so it fits in the saddlebag. So
Yeah.
our book was like this. Well, science and practice of evidence-based horsemanship, I would describe it almost as a readable textbook that has practical application for you and your horse. So the science part is really a deep dive, as deep as you want to get into the science. And then the practice part are all the things that you can use science to support in your observations, in your interactions, in your training with your horse. And so I think it'll really give you an eye and give you a lot of tools and a new lens to look through. And it is chock full of scientific evidence. It took me 3.5 years to write my part simply because I can't write, even if it's something that I know, I have to say, well, what's the evidence to support what I'm saying? So that's a painful task, this back and forth.
Yeah.
So my brain revolted and said, you're also creative. I do pencil drawing and I used to do poems. So I had written some poems about horses and how horses' nervous systems work. And I the more I looked at this, I understood that there's things called neuroaesthetics. So that this is things that our nervous system feels. So I thought I put a poem out there just to see if how it would go. And I got something like 1,500 likes right away. And people said, I don't want to read all the science. I don't want to read all the jargon. This I could feel. I knew what you were talking about in your poem. And so it's funny, I went to give a talk and a horse brain science clinic, and someone said, well, would you read a poem? And I said, well, I didn't bring the book with me. You have a book before I even got a book. And they said, no, we took and we laminated the poem and it hangs in our barn
Wow.
on the perception of horses because we want everybody to understand the perception and they might not want to read a book. And then a university professor contacted us and said, I'm writing a research proposal and I want permission to use your poem, one of the poems in your book, because if I just write the words, those people who are going to approve this study aren't going to feel what it is I'm trying to accomplish. So I need a felt sense. So one of the first poems that got out there was actually used to support science. But it's a book of poetry designed to give you a sense, a felt sense. They're poems about learned helplessness, about the synchrony of working together with your horse, about your horse just standing alone in the pasture and how your nervous systems interact, but written as poems. And then following each poem, I have a clinical postscript in which I describe what's going on in the nervous system in that poem. So you could read it as art just for the poems. You can feel it, which I hope you do, and you can actually feel it on and academically on a deeper level because that piece is in there as well. And I am so surprised. It's been out for about a week, and it became like number one in motivational poems, number one in horse care on Amazon, and it's been very popular, which was a big surprise to me. But I it's another way to communicate, and I'm really excited about that.
Well, I have the book already and I started reading it, and I can just say, I mean, everyone who knows me a little bit knows that I have the tendency to feel very deeply and to immediately, when something touches me emotionally, I start to cry when I feel it. And this book for me, I cried with a few poems because it's really exactly what you say. I mean, I find the analytical part interesting as well, and the poetry part is interesting, but you can literally feel the poem. And it's like, I feel it's like each nerve fiber of the body is like, yeah, that's how it is. That's really beautiful. I recommend that to everyone too. It's a very beautiful book. And the book with Martin, when does it come out? It comes out this
In the fall,
in the
in the
fall.
fall, un, unless I can find somebody with a bullwhip and a cattle prod to go out there and have him finish that little part that he still needs to. You know Martin, and he wants to make sure he said exactly what he wants to say. And he'll call me and say, I have one more story that needs to be in that book. He's not leaving anything behind. So he works it and reworks it and says, that's it. Exactly. And I know, probably after this podcast, I'll get a call and they'll say, hey, can I put one more story in that book? I said, Martin, we could do this for 20 years. We have to get this out. But our deadline is in the fall. You should see it in the fall.
Awesome. Well, Steve, as always, a very big pleasure talking to you. And yeah, I think we'll just have to do more of those in future.
I always love when we get together. So I agree.
I thank you a lot for your time, for your expertise, and for your will to put this out for people to learn from what you can teach us.